Karen Whitmore walked up the driveway with two board members trailing behind her, a thick folder pressed against her chest like a shield. Ethan Walker was kneeling by the flower bed when he heard the gate latch click, and he stood slowly, brushing dirt from his knees before he turned to face her. She did not wait for a greeting. She told him he had 30 days to remove the shed standing at the back corner of his property, her tone already rehearsed, already final, as though the conversation had ended before it began. Ethan asked her why. Karen said the Homeowners Association did not allow it, and she said it the way a woman says something she has said many times before, confident that repetition alone made it true. Ethan reached into his back pocket and pulled out the citation that had arrived 3 days earlier, the one with a number circled in red ink that still did not feel real to him. $25,000. He had assumed, standing in his kitchen that morning, that the number was a clerical mistake, a typo born of some overworked office assistant. He would learn, before the night was through, that it was no mistake at all, and that the number was the least surprising thing about what was coming. He had spent the rest of that morning replaying the exchange in his mind, certain there had to be a clause somewhere, some overlooked line in the covenants he had signed years ago, that would make sense of a number so far removed from the value of a wooden shed. He drove to the county courthouse that same afternoon, not out of any legal strategy, but out of the simple need to understand what he was facing, and left with more questions than he had arrived with. By the time evening came, he had convinced himself the hearing would be little more than a formality, a chance to explain the obvious absurdity of the claim to someone with the authority to dismiss it outright. That evening, under fluorescent lights in a courtroom that smelled faintly of old carpet and coffee, Karen sat across the aisle from him, her posture straight, her expression the calm of someone who has already counted her winnings. She glanced at him once, almost pityingly, the way a person looks at someone who does not yet understand the shape of the trouble he is in. Then the judge opened a folder that looked older than either of them, its edges soft and yellowed, and something in the room shifted. The judge looked up at Karen and asked, without raising his voice, whether she was certain she wanted to proceed with this case. Karen frowned, glanced at her attorney, and said that she was. The judge set the folder down on the bench in front of him, unhurried, and told her that she should know something before they went any further. He said the shed did not belong to Ethan Walker. Then he paused, letting the silence stretch long enough that even the court reporter looked up from her keyboard. He said it did not belong to the Homeowners Association either. Ethan Walker had lived in the same house on Larkspur Lane for the better part of a decade, a modest two-story colonial with white shutters and a yard that backed up against a stand of old oaks. He was not a man who sought attention. He worked steady hours at a regional engineering firm, kept his lawn trimmed, paid his dues on time, and avoided the sort of neighborhood disputes that seemed to consume other people's evenings. Behind his house, tucked into the far corner of the yard where the fence met the tree line, stood a garden shed he had built with his own hands, not long after moving in. It was nothing extravagant, just weathered cedar boards and a tin roof, built to hold a lawnmower, a set of hand tools, a coil of hose, and the accumulated clutter of a decade spent tending a modest patch of earth. It had never leaked, never leaned, never drawn a single complaint in all the years it had stood there. Ethan believed, the way most homeowners believe, that the paperwork behind his house was settled and sound, that his deed and his boundary lines were simple facts rather than open questions. Ethan had built the shed himself the summer after he closed on the house, working through long weekends with a rented saw and a stack of lumber he had hauled from the hardware store in the bed of his truck. He was not a carpenter by trade, and the corners were not perfectly square, but the structure had held firm through a decade of winters and storms, a small testament to patience rather than skill. He kept it stocked with the ordinary tools of a quiet life, a rake with a cracked handle he never got around to replacing, a coil of green garden hose, spare filters for the mower, a folding chair he sometimes carried out to sit beneath the oaks when the evenings were warm. Neighbors who passed on their walks barely noticed it, tucked as it was behind the fence line, and for years it existed as nothing more than a small, unremarkable fixture of the landscape, the kind of thing a person stops seeing after enough time has passed. The Homeowners Association that governed his street had changed leadership the previous spring, and the woman who took the gavel was Karen Whitmore, a name that would soon become synonymous among the residents of Larkspur Lane with clipboards and citations. Karen had opinions about everything. She had opinions about the shade of blue a homeowner had chosen for his shutters, about the placement of a neighbor's trash bins on collection morning, about a maple tree someone had planted too close to a shared fence line. She measured driveways with a tape measure she kept in her car. She photographed mailboxes she considered slightly askew. Some residents laughed about it behind closed doors, calling her the sheriff of Larkspur Lane, while others simply learned to keep their heads down and their hedges trimmed. It did not take long before her attention drifted toward the shed at the back of Ethan's property, a structure she began mentioning at board meetings with increasing frequency, always in the same clipped, procedural language, as though she were reciting a violation from memory rather than describing a piece of wood and tin that had done nothing but sit quietly for years. The first notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped into Ethan's mailbox between a water bill and a grocery flyer, its header printed in bold black letters that read "Unauthorized structure, immediate removal required." Ethan read it twice, certain there had been some confusion, some overlap of addresses, or an outdated survey that no longer matched the property. But it was the second line, printed smaller beneath the first, that made him go still in his driveway with the envelope still in his hand. It warned that failure to comply would result in an assessment of $25,000. He stood there a long moment, the morning traffic murmuring somewhere down the street, and felt for the first time that something about this was not going to be simple. He went to the association office that same week, hoping a short conversation would resolve what he assumed was an administrative error. Karen was waiting behind her desk when he arrived, as though she had known he would come, and she greeted him with the same practiced calm she used for every dispute that crossed her threshold. Ethan asked what gave the association the authority to fine him $25,000 over a garden shed. Karen told him the board had the power to apply what she called a special enforcement assessment, and she said it with the confidence of someone quoting scripture. He asked to see the exact clause. She slid across a photocopy of the community's covenants and restrictions, the pages dog-eared and heavily highlighted, and pointed to a section near the bottom of the second page. Ethan read it slowly. The language referred specifically to new construction, structures built after the covenants had been recorded, and made no mention at all of anything built years earlier, long before Karen had ever set foot on the board. He looked up at her and told her the clause did not apply, that his shed predated the very language she was citing. Karen's expression did not change, not at first. She told him she was the president of the association, that she understood the rules of this community better than anyone else who lived in it, and that he did not need to argue with her about it. Ethan, still calm, asked her to produce the original construction records, the documents that would show when the covenants were adopted and when his shed had been logged, if it had been logged at all. Karen said the association did not maintain records that far back. He asked reasonably how the board could enforce a violation it could not actually document. She told him that if he did not remove the structure, the association would increase the assessment, and she said it the way someone threatens a child, expecting obedience simply because the threat had been made. 3 days later, she came to his house in person, standing at the edge of his driveway with her arms folded, looking past him at the shed as though she could already see it gone. Ethan came out to meet her, still in his work clothes, wiping his hands on a rag he had carried out from the garage. She told him she was giving him one last chance, that the board had discussed his case at length and had decided, out of what she called genuine consideration, to offer him a final window to comply before things escalated further. He asked her what would happen if he refused. She told him the fines would only grow, that the lien process would move forward regardless of how reasonable he thought his position was, and that eventually the cost of fighting would exceed the cost of simply doing what she asked from the beginning. He asked her, directly, why a shed that had stood untouched for years suddenly warranted this much attention. She told him rules were rules, and that exceptions only invited more violations from other residents watching how the board handled his case. He told her he intended to keep asking for documentation until someone produced it. She told him he would make sure he regretted ever buying the house in the first place, and there was something in the way she said it, flat and unblinking, that told Ethan this had stopped being about a shed a long time ago. The letter that followed arrived within the week, printed on association letterhead, listing an outstanding balance of $25,000 and a notice that the board had authorized the filing of a lien against his property. Ethan sat at his kitchen table that night with the letter spread out in front of him, the number staring back at him under the overhead light, and for the first time since this had started, he felt something closer to anger than confusion. He pulled up his association account online and found the balance had grown even larger than the letter suggested, padded now with legal fees, an inspection fee, and something labeled simply as an administrative penalty, each line item stacked atop the last as though someone were trying to bury him under paperwork rather than reason with him. He printed the statement and set it beside the original citation, comparing the numbers line by line, searching for any explanation of how a modest garden shed had generated fees that now rivaled a used car. Nothing on the page offered a justification beyond vague administrative language, phrases borrowed from templates rather than anything specific to his property. He called the association's billing office the following morning and was transferred twice before a representative told him, apologetically, that questions about assessment amounts needed to go through the board directly, which meant, in practice, through Karen herself. He began asking around the neighborhood, quietly, over fences and in driveways, and what he heard troubled him more than the number on his account. Several longtime residents told him, in careful, lowered voices, that Karen had leaned on other homeowners before him, always over some structure or another, always with the same threats and the same rushed deadlines. A woman 2 streets over recalled how Karen had once fined a family nearly $4,000 over a wooden playhouse that had sat in their backyard for years, a fine that vanished from the books the moment the family agreed to tear it down rather than fight. Another man described how Karen had shown up at his door with a tape measure, insisting his fence sat 2 inches over an invisible line only she seemed able to see, and how he had simply paid rather than deal with the hassle of arguing. Each story followed the same shape, a citation arriving without warning, a number attached that felt designed to frighten rather than correct, and a quiet retreat from residents who decided the fight was not worth the exhaustion. One elderly man 3 doors down told him plainly that the shed had been standing in that yard since before the current association even existed, built by the previous owner years before Karen or her covenants had come into the picture. He said Karen had a way of speaking about the rules that made people forget they were allowed to ask questions at all. That conversation stayed with Ethan long after the man had gone back inside. He pulled the folder of paperwork he had kept from the day he purchased the house, sorting through inspection reports and title documents until he found an old property survey tucked near the bottom, its paper thin and slightly curled at the corners. He read through it twice, searching for any reference to the shed, to the boundary behind the fence line, to anything that might explain what Karen believed gave her the right to demand its removal. There was nothing. The section of the survey that should have addressed the rear corner of the property was simply missing, as though someone, at some point, had decided that particular piece of the record did not need to exist. Karen's final email arrived not long after, brief and businesslike, instructing him to remove the structure within 14 days. Ethan wrote back the same afternoon, asking her to provide proof that the association owned or controlled the land beneath the shed before he complied with anything. She never answered him directly. Instead, another notice appeared in his mailbox days later, this one warning of pending court action, and Ethan understood then that the conversation, if it could even be called that, was over. The court summons came on a gray afternoon, the kind of day that seemed appropriate for bad news, and Ethan read it standing in his own foyer with his coat still on. Karen had filed suit against him, and she was not simply asking the court to order the shed removed. She was asking for permission to force the sale of a portion of his property in order to collect the assessment she claimed he owed. He hired an attorney named Daniel Brooks, a real estate lawyer with a reputation for patience rather than theatrics, the kind of man who read every document twice before offering an opinion. Ethan had found Daniel through a recommendation from a coworker whose own property dispute years earlier had been resolved quietly and without drama, a quality Ethan valued more than aggression at this stage. Daniel's office sat above a small bakery downtown, the smell of bread drifting faintly through the vents even in the middle of the afternoon, and the space itself was cluttered in the comfortable way of a man who trusted his own filing system more than any digital database. Daniel spread the paperwork across his desk during their first meeting and studied it in silence for a long while before asking Ethan a question that seemed almost too simple. He asked whether Ethan was certain the land behind his house actually belonged to him. Ethan handed over his deed without hesitation, confident the answer was obvious. But Daniel took his time with the boundary description, running his fingers slowly along the language, comparing it against a copy of the association's own community map. Something did not align. The deed described a portion of land extending behind the house in one configuration, while the association's map depicted that same area differently, the lines drawn in a way that did not quite match. Daniel spent the following days working through the county's digital archive, cross-referencing plat numbers against old subdivision filings that had never been fully digitized, the kind of tedious work that rarely produced anything but occasionally produced everything. He pulled tax records stretching back decades, searching for any document that might explain the mismatch between the deed and the association's map. He telephoned a retired county clerk who had handled land records in the area for over 30 years, hoping she might remember something about the original subdivision plan that predated computerized filing systems. She could not recall the specifics, but she mentioned, almost in passing, that older neighborhoods like Larkspur Lane sometimes carried reservations and carve-outs that never made it cleanly into later paperwork, fragments of history that lingered in dusty file cabinets long after everyone who understood them had retired or passed on. Daniel requested records from the county, and what came back a few days later only deepened the mystery. Buried among the archive documents was an old parcel map, its ink faded but its details still legible, showing that a portion of the land behind Ethan's house carried a history of ownership unlike anything else on the street. The shed appeared to sit almost directly along the edge of what the old map identified as a separate parcel entirely, a sliver of land that seemed to exist apart from the rest of the neighborhood's ordinary boundary lines. Karen's lawsuit made no mention of this parcel at all, as though it simply did not exist in her version of events. Daniel asked Ethan whether Karen had ever shown him the original survey behind the association's claim, and Ethan admitted she never had. Daniel said quietly that they would need to find it themselves before the trial began. 2 days later, a scanned document arrived from the county archive, and in the corner of the old map, faint but unmistakable, was a small notation that read, "Reserved Parcel." Daniel explained what he had found over coffee that had long since gone cold, laying the map flat between them on the kitchen table. The small strip of land behind Ethan's house was not entirely within the association's control, not in the way Karen had always assumed. It carried a legal history that predated the neighborhood itself, a reservation written into the original development records decades earlier, long before the covenants Karen liked to quote had ever been drafted. Ethan sat back in his chair, turning over a memory he had nearly forgotten, a remark the previous owner had made in passing on the day he signed for the house. The man had told him, almost as an afterthought, that there were a few things about that particular piece of land that were not quite like the rest of the neighborhood. At the time, Ethan had assumed he meant the soil, or the drainage, or some minor quirk of landscaping. Now the words carried a different weight entirely. He went out to the garage that same evening and dug through a box of documents he had not opened since moving in, pulling out an old, brittle copy of the deed that had been passed down through the closing paperwork years before. Buried in the dense legal language was a mention of an easement and a reservation clause, phrases that meant little to him at the time but now seemed to point toward the very parcel Daniel had uncovered. It was not enough, on its own, to prove ownership outright, but it was enough to convince Daniel that they were looking in the right direction. Daniel kept digging through county records over the following days, and what he found next complicated the picture further. The parcel had once belonged to a family trust, an entity that had held the land for decades before the neighborhood around it had even been built. What struck Daniel as strange, and what he pointed out to Ethan with a raised eyebrow, was that the Homeowners Association had been collecting maintenance fees tied to that section of land for years, quietly folding it into its budget as though it were common property, despite never having actually obtained a deed transferring ownership to the association itself. Someone, at some point, had simply assumed control without ever securing the paperwork to back it up. And judging by the way Karen reacted when Ethan raised the subject with her directly, she seemed to know far more about that assumption than she was willing to admit. He found her outside the association office one afternoon, going through papers at her car, and he asked her plainly whether she knew anything about the reserved parcel. She went quiet for a moment, longer than felt natural, before telling him she did not know what he was talking about. Daniel, standing beside him, asked why the association had never included that particular survey in its own court filings if the land in question was truly as irrelevant as she claimed. Karen's composure slipped, just slightly, her jaw tightening as she gathered her folder and walked back inside without another word. That night, Daniel called Ethan at home, his voice carrying the particular energy of a man who has just found something he was not expecting. He told Ethan he had tracked down the name attached to the old trust records, and Ethan asked who it was. Daniel told him the name mattered, more than he could explain over the phone, and that they would go through it together before the trial. What Daniel had uncovered, piece by piece over the following days, was that Karen Whitmore's history with the neighborhood ran deeper than her role on the board. Years before she ever became association president, she had worked for a small real estate management firm, one that had, at one point, taken a serious interest in acquiring control of the very parcel now in question. If the association could establish authority over that strip of land, the value of every surrounding property, including the association's own reach and influence, would rise considerably. It was not simply a matter of enforcing tidy landscaping. It was leverage, and Karen had apparently understood that leverage long before she ever mailed Ethan his first citation. He was not, as it turned out, the first homeowner she had pressured over structures sitting near that boundary. Others had come before him, and each of them, faced with mounting fines and legal threats, had either torn down their structures or sold their homes rather than fight. Karen had likely expected Ethan to do the same. Daniel spent an entire afternoon tracing the management company's old filings, cross-checking names against the board rosters from the years before Karen ever ran for president. What he found was a pattern rather than a single smoking document, a slow accumulation of small decisions that, taken together, painted a far more deliberate picture than simple, overzealous enforcement. Karen had proposed, years earlier while still employed by the firm, a plan to consolidate several ambiguous parcels along the edges of developments like Larkspur Lane under association control, arguing in internal memos that doing so would streamline maintenance and increase surrounding property values. The plan had stalled when the firm lost the contract for that particular development, but Karen, it seemed, had never entirely let go of the idea. When she later moved into the neighborhood herself and eventually won a seat on the board, the reserved parcel behind Ethan's house sat waiting, exactly where she had once tried to claim it. Still unclaimed, still vulnerable to whoever pushed hardest to assert control over it first. Daniel found the document that changed everything only a few days before the trial was set to begin. A record showing plainly that the association had never actually acquired the parcel, not through purchase, not through donation, not through any legal transfer whatsoever. Karen had spent years operating as though the land belonged to the association, using that assumption to justify fines and pressure campaigns, when in truth the association held no legal claim to it at all. Ethan asked Daniel, if that was true, who the shed actually belonged to. Daniel told him that was precisely the question they were going to put in front of the judge. The morning of the trial arrived cold and overcast, and Karen walked into the courtroom flanked by her attorney, glancing at Ethan with the same faint, confident smile she had worn the day she first stood in his driveway. She still believed, it was clear, that she would walk out of that room with exactly what she had come for. Judge Marcus Reed presided over the case with the unhurried authority of a man who had heard 1,000 disputes just like this one, though something in his expression suggested he sensed there was more to this particular matter than the paperwork suggested. Ethan sat beside Daniel at the defense table, his hands folded in front of him, watching the room fill with the quiet shuffle of papers and the low murmur of attorneys reviewing final notes. A handful of neighbors had come to watch, the word of the dispute having spread quietly through Larkspur Lane in the weeks leading up to the hearing, and their presence in the gallery gave the room a heavier weight than Ethan had expected. Karen's attorney opened by laying out the association's position plainly. The Homeowners Association, he argued, held the authority to manage and enforce the community's standards, and Ethan Walker had violated those standards by maintaining an unauthorized structure without ever seeking board approval. He presented photographs of the shed, weathered and modest, framing it as though it were an eyesore rather than a decade-old fixture that had never drawn a single prior complaint. He reminded the court that the assessment of $25,000 had been properly authorized under the community's covenants. Karen sat behind him, calm, arms folded, watching Ethan the way a person watches an outcome they have already decided. Daniel did not begin by arguing about the shed at all. Instead, he asked a single question that seemed to catch the opposing table off guard. He asked who actually owned the land on which the shed was standing. Karen's attorney answered without hesitation that the defendant did, gesturing toward Ethan as though the matter were self-evident. Daniel asked him to produce the evidence. The attorney offered Ethan's deed, the same document Ethan had shown Karen weeks earlier, and Daniel studied it briefly, before telling the court, calmly, that the deed did not establish what the association was claiming it did. The room went quiet in a way that felt different from before, the kind of silence that settles when something unexpected is about to happen. He walked the judge through the timeline methodically, starting with the original subdivision filing and moving forward year by year, showing how the language describing the reserved parcel had never once been amended or transferred in any of the association's own recorded meeting minutes. Karen's attorney objected twice, arguing the documents were outside the scope of the original complaint, but Judge Reed overruled him both times, noting that ownership of the underlying land was directly relevant to whether the association had any authority to issue the assessment in the first place. Daniel produced the old parcel map from the county archive, laying it carefully on the evidence table for the judge to examine. Judge Reed leaned forward, studying the faded lines and the small notation in the corner, and something in his expression shifted from routine attentiveness to genuine focus. Karen, watching from her seat, began to shift in her chair, her earlier composure thinning by the second. Daniel addressed the court directly, telling the judge that the association had fined his client $25,000 over a structure sitting on a parcel the association had never actually owned. Judge Reed looked up from the map and turned his attention to Karen. He asked her plainly whether she had known this document existed. Karen hesitated, glancing briefly at her attorney before telling the judge she did not remember. The judge did not accept the answer easily, and he repeated the question, his tone patient but unmistakably firm, making it clear he expected a real response rather than a deflection. Karen's attorney tried a different angle, arguing that even if the association did not technically hold title to the parcel, it had exercised control over the land for years without objection, and that long-standing practice should carry some legal weight of its own. Daniel countered calmly, telling the court that occupying or maintaining land without ever securing a deed did not create ownership, no matter how many seasons of mowing or maintenance the association could point to. He reminded the judge that Ethan Walker had never been notified of any dispute over that boundary in all his years of residency, had never once been told the land behind his fence was anything other than his own, and had built and maintained the shed under that same reasonable belief for the better part of a decade. Judge Reed nodded slowly at this, making a note on the paper in front of him, and asked Karen's attorney whether the association had ever commissioned an independent survey of its own before issuing the assessment against Ethan. The attorney admitted, after a pause that lasted a beat too long, that it had not. Daniel followed with additional records pulled from the county office, laying out a clear and unbroken history of ownership for the reserved parcel, a history that never once included the Homeowners Association at any point along the way. There was no deed of transfer, no recorded conveyance, nothing that gave the board the legal standing to impose covenants on that section of land at all. More importantly, the shed itself had been standing there long before Ethan Walker ever purchased the property, meaning the structure predated the very enforcement clause Karen had used to justify the fine in the first place. An association could not simply declare ownership over property it had never legally acquired, no matter how many assessments it chose to levy against it. Judge Reed asked Daniel whether he had any further evidence to submit, and Daniel produced one final document, a set of internal association memos obtained through the discovery process, memos that traced Karen's early interest in the parcel back to her years with the management firm. He did not dwell on it at length, choosing instead to let the paper speak for itself, but the implications settled over the room clearly enough that no one needed it spelled out. The judge studied the pages for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before setting them aside with the rest of the evidence. Karen attempted to push back, insisting that the association had always treated the parcel as common property, that its maintenance budget had covered the area for years, and that intent should count for something. Judge Reed turned to her attorney and asked him to explain, in plain terms, how the association justified enforcing restrictions on land it did not legally control. The attorney faltered, offering a vague reference to long-standing community practice, an answer that clearly did not satisfy the bench. The gallery had gone almost entirely silent by this point, the earlier murmur of shuffling papers replaced by a stillness that seemed to press against the walls of the room. Even Karen's own attorney had stopped writing, his pen resting motionless against his legal pad as he waited to see where the judge was headed. Judge Reed reached for a final folder resting at the edge of his desk, the same one he had opened the night this whole ordeal had truly begun to unravel. He looked at Ethan for a long moment, then turned his gaze toward Karen. He told her he believed she had misunderstood something fundamental about the nature of her position. Karen asked him what he meant. He told her that authority granted by a homeowner's board did not, on its own, create ownership of property. Karen said nothing. The judge continued, his voice even but pointed, explaining that no one, no matter their title, and could penalize another person over property they themselves had no legal claim to control. He told the room there was something more troubling still contained within the records in front of him, and he turned to the final page of the folder before continuing. He said the documents showed that the association, or at least certain individuals connected to it, had been aware of this exact issue for years. The court then turned its attention to establishing who actually held legal claim to the reserved parcel, and the answer, when it emerged from the trust records Daniel had submitted, surprised nearly everyone in the room. Ownership of that narrow strip of land had passed, through a chain of historical transactions tied to the original family trust, into a broader parcel transfer that had occurred decades earlier, one that had ultimately folded that reserved section into the very property Ethan now called home. The transfer had been legitimate and properly recorded at the time, but it had been overlooked in later years, buried beneath newer surveys and association paperwork that never bothered to trace the title back far enough to notice it. In simple terms, the strip of land behind Ethan's fence, the very ground his shed had stood on for years, had belonged to him the entire time, folded quietly into his own chain of title, long before Karen ever mailed him a single citation. The implications settled over the courtroom slowly. The association had no ownership claim to the parcel, it had no authority to order the shed removed, and it certainly had no legal basis for demanding $25,000 from a homeowner over a structure sitting on his own land. Judge Reed confirmed, formally and for the record, that Ethan Walker held clear legal title to both the parcel and the shed standing upon it. Karen had said, earlier in the proceedings, that the association owned everything within its boundaries, stating it with the same unwavering certainty she brought to every conversation about Larkspur Lane. Judge Reed corrected her directly, his voice calm but unmistakably final. He told her that was not the case. He gestured toward the map still resting on the evidence table, tracing a line with his finger to show the true boundary of the association's authority. Then he moved his finger further, to the small parcel tucked behind it, and told her plainly that this portion belonged to Ethan Walker, not to the board she represented. The ruling that followed left little room for interpretation. Judge Reed voided the $25,000 assessment in its entirety. He denied the association's request to force the removal of the shed. He ordered the lien against Ethan's property released without delay. He further ruled that the association would bear a portion of the legal costs incurred in defending against a claim built on a foundation the board never actually possessed. And he ordered the association to correct its internal records regarding the reserved parcel, so that no future homeowner would find themselves facing the same baseless threat. Karen sat frozen in her seat as the ruling was read, her earlier composure entirely gone, replaced by something closer to disbelief. But the judge was not finished. Before adjourning, he said he had one further question for the association's representatives, and the room fell silent again as he asked it. He wanted to know how many similar assessments the board had collected from other homeowners over the years, based on this same flawed interpretation of ownership. The question did not receive an answer that day, but it did not need to. Word of what had happened in that courtroom spread through Larkspur Lane faster than any newsletter the association had ever printed. Residents who had quietly paid fines years earlier, believing they had no real choice, began comparing notes over fences and driveways, piecing together a pattern that had been hiding in plain sight. Several of them requested copies of their own old assessments, curious now whether their situations mirrored Ethan's far more closely than they had ever realized. Within weeks, the association's finances came under closer scrutiny than they had seen in years. A group of homeowners petitioned for a special meeting, demanding a full accounting of every enforcement assessment issued under Karen's leadership. The meeting, when it finally happened, ran far longer than anyone expected. Filled with pointed questions Karen struggled to answer with her usual confidence. Residents who had never spoken up before stood one after another, describing fines they had quietly paid over playhouses and fences and paint colors, each story adding weight to a pattern that had taken years to fully surface. A retired schoolteacher who lived at the end of the block asked, in a voice that carried through the entire room, how many of those old assessments had ever been backed by an actual survey rather than Karen's own judgment. No one on the board could answer her. By the time a vote was called, Karen's support among the residents had eroded almost entirely. She was removed from the presidency that same evening, replaced by a smaller committee that pledged, publicly and repeatedly, to review every assessment before enforcing it and to maintain actual documentation for every claim the board made going forward. Within a month, the new committee had refunded a portion of several disputed fines to residents who came forward with old paperwork, a quiet acknowledgement of years spent operating on assumption rather than evidence. Karen sold her house on Larkspur Lane before the following spring arrived, moving out quietly on a weekday morning with a moving truck that drew far less attention than any of her old citations ever had. Few neighbors came out to say goodbye. The new committee spent months untangling the association's old records, hiring an independent surveyor to walk every disputed boundary on the street and produce documentation that finally matched reality rather than assumption. Several residents who had torn down sheds and playhouses under Karen's earlier pressure asked, half joking and half serious, whether they could rebuild now that the rules had actually been clarified. The committee told them yes, so long as they filed the proper paperwork this time, paperwork that finally existed to be filed. Ethan did not seek further punishment beyond what the court had already ordered. He never asked for Karen to be publicly shamed, never pushed for additional penalties beyond what the ruling required. He simply wanted the association to follow the rules it claimed to uphold, and once the lien was lifted and the assessment erased from his account, he considered the matter closed. The shed remained exactly where it had always stood, tucked into the back corner of his yard beneath the old oaks. He spent the following weekend tending the garden around it, replacing a few boards that had weathered thin over the years, repainting the small door a deep forest green. No more citations arrived in his mailbox. No more clipboard inspections interrupted his mornings. On a quiet evening not long after, with the sky turning orange behind the tree line, Ethan walked out to the shed and pulled open its door, looking in at the familiar clutter of tools and coiled hose and the old lawnmower he had never gotten around to replacing. The hinges creaked the same way they always had, a small, ordinary sound that felt oddly comforting after months of certified letters and courtroom silences. He ran his hand along the doorframe he had built with his own measurements all those years ago, the wood worn smooth in places where his palm had rested 100 times before. It was strange to think that this simple structure, the one thing that had nearly cost him a portion of his own property, was now standing exactly as it always had, undisturbed and unremarkable, a shed and nothing more. exactly as it had been before anyone ever decided it was worth $25,000. Daniel had come by that evening to drop off the final paperwork closing out the case, and he stood beside Ethan for a moment, looking at the shed with something like quiet amusement. He asked Ethan whether he planned on keeping it. Ethan smiled, telling him of course he was. Daniel asked almost teasingly whether he meant even after everything they had just gone through. Ethan looked at the shed a moment longer before answering. He said it was standing precisely because of everything they had just gone through. As the sun dropped lower behind the oaks, the camera of memory, if such a thing existed, seemed to pull back slowly from that quiet backyard, the shed standing solid against the fading light. The garden around it settled and calm once more. Karen Whitmore had once believed that a title and a clipboard gave her the authority to decide who owned what within the boundaries she policed. But on that night in the courtroom, a judge had reminded her of something far simpler than any covenant she had ever quoted. Authority was never the same thing as ownership, and no amount of power borrowed from a position could ever outweigh the truth written plainly into the land itself.